You're standing in a mosquito-infested South American jungle in the late 1970s, watching guys in sandals literally stomp on dead leaves mixed with aviation fuel and battery acid. And somehow, this exact puddle of toxic sludge is about to generate enough untraceable cash to buy a private island, fund a shadow army, and completely break the United States border. How did a bunch of small-time smugglers stuffing smelly weed into suitcases pivot to a product so ridiculously profitable that they literally ran out of places to hide the physical money? Join me as I explain how it all happened. In the early 1970s, smuggling contraband into the United States was basically a cottage industry. The product of choice was marijuana. The logistics were hilariously simple, but practically it was a total nightmare. Smugglers would stuff dried leaves into ordinary suitcases, cram them into the hulls of small fishing boats, or fly them over the border in single-engine planes. But as a business model, marijuana had a massive, glaring flaw. Time for an ELI-5 analogy. Imagine you are trying to sneak a live animal into a movie theater to sell it. If you sneak in a mouse, it's tiny, it fits in your pocket, and nobody notices. If you try to sneak in an adult African elephant, it's going to take up the entire lobby. It smells terrible, and if an usher opens the door, even a crack, the gig is entirely up. Marijuana was the elephant. It was incredibly bulky, highly aromatic, and required massive physical space to move very little monetary value. If the Border Patrol opened one bag, the entire operation went up in smoke. Traffickers needed the mouse. They needed a product that was compact, completely odorless, and carried astronomical profit margins. They found it in a tiny white powder, cocaine. Now, the source material wasn't new. As British documentarian Dominic Streatfeild lays out in his book Cocaine, an unauthorized biography, the history of the coca leaf stretches back millennia. Indigenous communities in the Andes Mountains chewed the natural leaves to fight off fatigue and altitude sickness. It was a sacred medicinal plant. 450 years before the civilized world discovered local anesthesia, the Incas were literally performing brain surgery using numbing coca. But the modern cartel didn't just sell this product, they industrialized its creation. In hidden jungle laboratories across Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, the chemistry was brutal. It took roughly 138 kilograms of raw coca leaves, crushed and chemically washed in pits with gasoline, acid, and lime, just to extract 1 single kilogram of pure cocaine base. But the economics were irresistible. A kilo that cost roughly $1,500 to manufacture in the jungle could be sold on the streets of Miami for a staggering $50,000. George Young, one of the most prolific early American smugglers, once described the realization of this profit margin. He noted that it was basically a license to print money, saying, "It was as if I was carrying a load of gold bullion, but it was weightless." This quote perfectly captures the sheer disbelief these early smugglers felt. They weren't just making money, they were breaking the fundamental laws of street-level economics. As the cash started piling up, small-time criminals realized that the old suitcase methods would no longer cut it. This brings us to the massive scaling phase of the trade, spearheaded by a ruthless Colombian named Pablo Escobar and a brilliant, eccentric logistics mastermind named Carlos Lehder. Together with other crime families, they formed a massive corporate syndicate, the Medellín Cartel. To understand how people actually got the product, you have to look at the sky. The cartel completely abandoned commercial flights and bought an entire fleet of private airplanes. They hired daring pilots to fly low over the ocean, skimming just above the waves to completely bypass radar checkpoints, dropping duffel bags of white bricks straight into the swamps of South Florida. The operation became so extraordinarily wealthy, pulling in an estimated $60 million a day at its peak, that they literally outgrew traditional hiding spots. In 1978, Carlos Lehder did something that sounds like the plot of a cartoon supervillain. He literally bought Norman's Cay, a small private island in the Bahamas. And when I say he bought it, I mean he forced the local residents and vacationers out at gunpoint. Take the documented human experience of Professor Richard Novak, a former resident who literally watched his island paradise get taken over by heavily armed drug runners. Novak testified that Lehder's men simply showed up, shot a warning burst into the air, and told people they had until sunset to get off the island forever. Lehder built a massive protected runway and turned the entire island into a fortified midpoint refueling station for drug planes heading to the mainland. Lehder viewed himself as a revolutionary. To him, the drug trade was political. He famously called cocaine the atomic bomb of Latin America, viewing it as a weapon to destroy American imperialism from the inside out. But empires built on astronomical piles of cash and extreme violence tend to attract attention. By the early 1980s, the sheer volume of wealth and violence exploding in South Florida forced the United States government to push back hard. President Richard Nixon had declared the official war on drugs years earlier, but now the Reagan administration stepped in. They formed massive multi-agency task forces, utilizing military radar and the Coast Guard to completely choke out the Caribbean airspace. Almost overnight, the air routes through the Bahamas were shut down. The Colombians were suffocating on their own supply. They desperately needed a backdoor. They looked west, toward Mexico. For decades, Mexican smuggling networks had been quietly moving marijuana and heroin across the massive, porous U.S. land border. A former Mexican police officer named Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo had recently united these disparate smuggling plazas into a single powerful organization, the Guadalajara Cartel. The Colombians cut a deal. They would fly the product into Mexico, and the Mexican cartels would handle the high-risk border crossing using their established tunnels, hidden truck compartments, and bribed officials. Because of how fast they bounced the product across the border, Mexico earned a permanent nickname in the logistics world, the Trampoline. Initially, the Mexican networks were just simple couriers. They got paid a flat cash fee, usually a few $1,000s, for every kilo they successfully moved. But moving tens of millions of dollars in physical cash back across the border was getting incredibly difficult. So, the Mexican bosses made a genius strategic demand. They stopped asking for cash and started demanding to be paid in product, eventually taking up to 50% of every shipment as their fee. This single change flipped the global balance of power forever. As journalist and author Eoin Grillo explains in his book El Narco, inside Mexico's criminal insurgency, the criminal organizations in Mexico were fundamentally transforming. Grillo notes that this massive escalation filled the power vacuum left behind by the delicate, corrupt system of Mexico's single-party political rule at the time. By taking the product itself, the Mexican cartels stopped being delivery boys and became the ultimate wholesalers. They built their own distribution cells inside American cities. Eventually, they heavily outmuscled their old Colombian partners to become the undisputed rulers of the global empire. The shift from the Colombian cartels to the Mexican cartels isn't just a story about business logistics. It's a story about how treating a massive socioeconomic issue strictly as a border enforcement problem often just pushes the violence to a new geographic location. When the U.S. successfully squeezed the Caribbean routes, the demand for the product didn't drop. The route just adapted, and in the process, it birthed a new, incredibly violent conflict that still rages today. History loves to teach us that whenever there is an insatiable demand, someone, somewhere, is going to figure out the supply chain. Even if they have to buy a private island, bribe an entire government, or literally stomp on poisonous leaves in a jungle to make it happen. But how did those modern cartels actually manage to build their own private paramilitary armies equipped with better weapons than the actual local police? Well, next time on His Mythical.